Chapter 8. The Story. Actors tell stories. They tell them with behavior, but they tell stories nonetheless. So, if an actor is going to do a good job when telling a story, they need to know at least the basics of what makes a story good. Just what are the elements of a good story? What are the things that good stories have that draws us to them? What makes a story that other people will want to hear or see? I have found the following 6 things to be indispensable to a good story. They are: conflict, consequence, contrast, character, development, immediacy. This is quite a list, isn't it? Let's work our way through, starting with that good old standard. The conflict. For a long while, stories were divided into those that had conflict, the dramas, and those that didn't, the comedies. I was never really happy with this division. It didn't take into account a lot of things that I knew were important. Besides, every good comedy that I saw had conflict of some sort. So conflict was not the exclusive attribute of drama that I had been led to believe. Included in my dissatisfaction of conflict was the annoying tendency of people who wrote about these things to leave the word undefined from their point of view. They assumed that I would already know, or they would use the word conflict as a catch-all for bad thinking. So I spent a little time in some dictionaries. I also spent some time ruminating about how the definitions that I found would fit into the storytelling process. This is what I came up with. Conflict is the opposition of 2 forces over the same thing. It could involve energies, intents, desires, wills, land, politics, thinking, nearly anything, or anyone at all. Inherent in this is the idea that both these people, or groups, feel justified in their desires. But these desires have to be focused on a single thing before there is conflict. This is important to acting because it means that you have to have a reason for wanting what it is that you want. A reason that you feel is right within your own point of view. A reason that will justify your actions. This reason has to be about the exact same thing that someone else wants. I suppose that here, like anywhere else, if the writer doesn't supply the reason, then you have to. Mostly, though, the writer will supply the justifications for your side, or at least the big ones. That is usually what the story is about. In any case, you must look for those justifications and make them your own, no matter what side you are on. And you must understand what it is that the conflict focuses on. This is the single thing that is the center of the issue. But this leaves us with conflict in every story, and here's where the barriers between comedy and drama began to break down for me. Because there was conflict in every good comedy that I have seen. In fact, every type of story that I know has the element of conflict in it. So, I started to look around for something that would explain what the difference between these 2 types of stories, comedy and drama, are. Then, I remembered something that I had heard a Shakespeare professor talk about in class one day. Someone had asked how you tell the dramas from the comedies in Shakespeare. She said that the easy way to tell the dramas from the comedies was to figure out whether everyone dies at the end, or everyone gets married at the end. If everyone dies, it is a drama, and if everyone marries, it is a comedy. So the difference between these 2 major story types, for Shakespeare, was the outcome of the conflict. While this is a rather simplistic way of looking at the difference, it does bring to the surface the one thing that really does separate the 2 kinds of stories. The consequence. Every story has people going through events. But the consequence of those events vary greatly. This has a great deal to do with how we relate ourselves, as the audience, to the story. If the events are about people dealing with life and death matters, then we tend to call the story a drama. But if those people are going through events that are frivolous and only lead to silliness, then we think of the story as a comedy. In between, a raw manner of blending. So Shakespeare's means of defining the 2 story types is a pretty good rule of thumb. For the actor, the second element of a good story is the consequence. What is the outcome of this opposition of forces over the same thing? What does it mean that one side is triumphant over the other? Which side are you on, and what happens to your side? These are all questions that you could ask yourself about the story to focus on this element, consequence. But are stories only made up of opposing forces and their consequences? No, they are not, and thank the stars that they are not. Inherent in the idea of opposition is that there is something different about the two sides. This gives us a contrast that we can use to choose from, a way to tell a side that we can root for. And this difference is our next story element. The contrast. Contrast is the difference between the two groups, the good guys and the bad guys. But contrast has a broader reach and application in storytelling than just defining the two opposing groups. Contrast is necessary to every part of the story. The groups, the people within the groups, the individuals themselves, are all filled with contrast. You can't walk down the street and not see contrast in everyone and everything that you meet. The world is full of contrast. Some are tall and some are short. Some believe one thing and others another. Some like one thing and some another thing. Some things are big and others are small. Some are one color and others are a completely different color. Contrast is basic to our world, and so it is basic to our stories of the world. So the element of contrast is necessary to storytelling and should be looked for when you are going over the story. You always need this element. And indeed, most writers supply enough contrast that it isn't hard to find. It is the audience's means of telling one thing from another. But there is one story type that needs contrast more than any other. When I first began to direct, I realized very quickly that when there was a lack of serious conflict, like in comedy, then other story elements began to take on a greater share of the workload. I noticed this, specifically about comedy. In comedy, conflict, and especially consequence, are decreased to a level that they are not the focus of what the story is about. But comedies seem to thrive on contrast. The easiest example of how this works are the great comedy teams, Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello, Martin and Lewis. All of them had contrast as their central image. Contrast seemed to be everywhere in comedy. So I decided to push this type of contrast in the comedy pieces that I was directing, and suddenly the laughter became stronger. So the contrast of type is a prime ingredient in comedy. But there was one other contrast, besides the contrast of types, that comedy had. It was the contrast of response. Remember when I was talking about the universal human response? It is the response that we all recognize as being appropriate for the moment and for the event that we have just seen, because we are all human. Well, I realized that comedy alters this response by adding contrast between the comedian's response and the universally expected response. So the comedic actor exaggerates the response, or undercuts the response, or they give us a totally unexpected response. The good comedic writer knows this, and includes these altered responses in the story. And these are the jokes. The exaggerated response, over, or under, the different response, the slant, or the unexpected response, the twist. All of these comedic tools have at their basis the element of contrast. But where does contrast come from? It doesn't come from the conflict or the consequence. It is inherent in the basic differences of people. And that brings us to our next element. The character. The very foundation of contrast in stories is the differences between individuals. One individual reacts differently and does things differently than another individual. We are all unique in ourselves. Bundle us into groups, and similarities exist. But essentially, because of different genetic makeups and different basic personalities, we are all very different from one another. We all have different character. So I am not talking about the character type here, but about the basis of our personalities. This is important to storytelling. First off, because one's character is the source of conflict and contrast. Secondly, because by telling stories about the difference in people's character, we learn about how we are similar or different as individuals. And thirdly, because by seeing how other characters manage the events of their lives, we can use this information to guide our own lives or reaffirm our own values. Frankly, these three things are why we tell stories at all. So we watch stories, to see different characters interact. But is that all that we need from stories? Characters conflicting and contrasting with one another? No, remember that there are also consequences. And in order for there to be consequences, the status quo must change from what it is to something new. This change is called story development, and it is the next element that all stories need. The development. Development is in every part of the story. It is the events of the story, and it is how the characters of the story change. There are two types of development: event development, the plot, and character development, the people. When the development is the events of the story, we call it the plot. The story begins with the situation, or of building conflict, moves through the activities, with all the ups and downs, and ends with a resolution of the situation, either for one side or the other, in some cases, a mixture of the two. However the writer chooses to hide, or not hide, this structure, this is what happens. When the development that takes place is in the people themselves, we call it character development. It follows the same arc that the plot does. The character's internal situation is one thing at the start of the story. The person then goes through the various events, all the ups and downs, both externally and internally. This goes on until there is either an internal resolution, leading to an external resolution, or the reverse. An external resolution, leading to an internal resolution. At that point, the story ends. We see the character struggle with the situation, and become a new person because of this struggle. Either they have changed their values, or they have strengthened and reaffirmed them. In either case, they are a different person at the end. Watching them, we have learned a little bit more about how we work as human beings, or about what we believe to be true about humans in the world. Both types of development are needed in all stories. I remember when the film Dick Tracy came out. It was a splashy film with a lot of action and a good story, except for one thing. The hero of the story, Tracy, starts out the film by being unable to ask the woman that he loves to marry him. His non-proposal is interrupted, and the story follows him through his fight and triumph over the bad guys. But at the end of the film, he is again faced with the situation of proposing to his love. He can't do it. So, for us sitting in the audience, he is exactly the same person at the end of the film that he was in the beginning. There was no development in his character at all, and he was a disappointment to the audience. Because this film, while it had a good plot, it left out the other side of the development coin, his character's development. I prefer stories with a lot of both types of development, story development, and character development. In any case, at the end of the film, both of these types of development should have taken place to make up a good story. So now we are nearing the conclusion of the story. But are these all the elements of a good story? Well, in terms of the structure, this pretty much covers it. But there is something else that a good story needs that makes it so much more involving than just these elements. It is the reason that we have plays and films in the first place. I call this element immediacy. The immediacy. This is, for lack of a better word, what draws the audience into the story and keeps them there. It is the direct responsibility of the actor. It is the actor's job. I have actually talked a lot about this throughout this book. Think back to all the times that I have talked about the relationship between the actor and the audience. All these things were designed to give you, the actor, a way to set up a direct connection to the event that you are experiencing at this very moment. This connection gives you a direct connection to the audience, and the audience a direct cause and effect connection to you through the events that they see you experience. Immediacy then is the audience seeing the event and then seeing the person, you, react to that event and only to that event. If you react to an event that the audience cannot see, or if you react in a way that isn't created by that event, then the immediacy of the audience's involvement is lost, and the audience becomes confused. They will sit there thinking, what did you react to, and what does it have to do with what we just saw? If it doesn't fit with what we just saw, Then what is it there for? When the audience has to stop to think about these questions, even subconsciously, they are not paying attention to the story any longer, and their involvement suffers. Since this involvement is what you want to create and foster, that involvement is directly in your control by the way that you react to the event that they just saw. That involvement is what makes the audience go home satisfied. This final element, immediacy, is something that only the actor can create within the story. It is the actor's unique contribution to the acting art form. The audience cannot create it for you. The director cannot give it to you. You can't pick it up at the local hardware. Only you can create it through your hard work. Only you can create it by the way that you react, and only if you are in the moment. Only if you react to what both you and the audience sees. Let's move on. Thanks for watching.